Well, we're sitting here in the gardens, and I've been associated with this place professionally now for 25 years, and the gardens administer the Sydney Domain, which is a very special place in people's lives in this city. The statue behind us is Sir John Robinson, and I can remember when I first came to Sydney, I didn't have a clue who this fellow was. And that's in the context of my poem Sunday Afternoon that you'll hear in a minute. Robinson was in fact a politician, and he's the only politician who's represented in these gardens with a statue. And in my research I found that Henry Lawson's mother, Louisa, had campaigned in The Dawn, which was her magazine, for this statue, because Robinson had worked for free settlement and public education. As far as the gardens were concerned, his great claim to fame here was that he opened the domain to the people of Sydney. Previously the domain had been the governor's backyard, and he opened it up and it became known as the park where the gates never closed. It became a speaker's corner from about 1878. And from there on in, it tended to be a place where the public gathered. You had bands and you had oratory. And as such, it has served as a useful social safety valve for the city. I came to Sydney in 1962 and I was a country boy and I was wide-eyed and bushy-tailed. And I heard about this place and I came here and I was absolutely enthralled. It was free entertainment, and they talked about nothing else but politics, sex and religion, and I had never heard such conversations in my life before, and I loved it. Some of the characters here, in a sort of a sweep from where we're standing, would have included Ada and her tambourine, a fellow we used to call Big Red, who had this massive booming voice and you could hear him right across the domain. Sitting under that fig tree there was an anti-evolutionist, and next to him was a flat earth man, believe me, in 1962. And then across under an oak tree that has now been removed was Charlie the rationalist, and he was a delight. Behind him, under the big fig, was the Roman Catholic Church representative, and in the far corner were the communists. And then later we had a really incredible character called Webster, John Webster, who came a little bit later.
Who did that? Tried to burn the Bible as well, my friend.
Where does it mention the Soviet Union in the Old Testament?
Yeah, in Ezekiel 38.
Sunday afternoon, Sydney Domain in the 60s. Young loving, arm in arming, Sunday afternooning, Sydney Domain. For half day a week in the fig shade, freedom of speech for the proletariat. Free speakers, free thinkers, free lovers, free sunshine. Red flags, red coats, red hair, long hair. Irishman placards, Mayday marches, weekend hippies, ice cream and LSD. Policemen and addicts, tourists and day trippers, hardcore whingers and the ratbag fringe. Old Bolsheviks slapping each other on the back, poofta-bashing and scowling at dissent. The right defend Vietnam and the draft, and would smite the godless as a tsetse fly. The modern science of death plumbs career instead of truth. Commercial Christmas smiles, kill a commie for Christ. Populate or perish is the cry. Contain the yellow peril, dagos, wogs and wops, and keep Australia white. The rationalist sneers at the DLP. Short back and sides, 3 cheers for the Paraclete. Ada and her tambourine converting sinners. Red and his big voice and an angel singing. Canting fundamentalists extolling purges can't come to grips with their own urges. Ye must be born again, the end is nigh. Bligh would have turned in his grave. Webster up his ladder votes open slather. Social sex and laughter, sign of the goat. The ape man stoops to his stroller, an album of old Harry's, douanier of the domain. Jack Spratt for a flat earth in a pop age dismisses satellites as illusions and propaganda. All this before gay lib and women's rights, Hare Krishnas and the Festival of Light. Robbie Burns with a dripping pen leans on a plough and watches on, recently washed. Across the park, white splotched, scholar, citizen, patriot. Green-crusted brass, a man long dead, patina of pigeon shit upon his head.
We're now standing in front of the statue of Robert Burns. When the statue was unveiled in January 1905, it was apparently one of the wettest days on record. And we know that Henry Lawson was in the crowd. Now, it's my belief that Henry would not have been invited because he wouldn't have been in the in crowd at that stage. And I suspect he was suffering from a severe attack of professional jealousy because he wrote a really fascinating poem that was published in the Bulletin just after that in February 1905 called Bobby's Statue. And in that he is sneering at the toffs who are grovelling to the dead poet, and he's basically saying, you know, had the poet been alive they would have crossed the street, you know, they wouldn't have invited him into their homes, but now they're all rabbiting on.
Bobby's Statue. Grown tired of mourning for my sins and brooding over merits, the other night with aching heart I went amongst the spirits, and I met one that I knew well. Oh, Scotty's ghost, is that you? And did you see the fearsome crowd at Bobby Burns's statue? They hurried up in hansom cabs, tall hatted and frock-coated. They trained it in from all the towns, the weird and hairy-throated. They spoke in some outlandish tongue, they cut some comic capers, and ilka man was wild to get his name in all the papers. They showed no sign of intellect, those frauds who rushed before us. They knew one verse of Auld Lang Syne, the first one and the chorus. They clacked the clack of Scotland's bard, they glibly talked a rabby. But what if he had come to them without a groat and shabby? They drank and wept for rabby's sake, they stood and brayed like asses. The living bard's a drunken rake, the dead one loved the lasses. If Robbie Burns were here, they'd sit as still as any mouse is. If Bobby Burns should come their way, they'd turn him out their houses. Oh, weep for bonny Scotland's bard, and praise the Scottish nation, who made him spy and let him die heartbroken in privation. Exciseman so that he might live through northern winter's rigours, just as in southern lands they give the hard-up rhymer figures. We need some songs of stinging fun to wake the states and light 'em. I wish a man like Robert Burns were here today to write 'em. But still the mockery shall survive till day of judgment crashes. The men we scorn when we're alive, with praise insult our ashes. And Scotty's ghost said, never mind the fleas that you inherit. The living bard can flick 'em off, they cannot hurt his spirit. The crawlers round the poet's name shall crawl through all the ages. His work's the living thing, and they are fly dirt on the pages.
Well, here we are in front of the statue to Henry Lawson, and it's remarkable that Henry got himself a statue here in the domain, considering that he was a pauper for most of his life. We don't know if he actually slept rough in the domain, but there is a couplet in a poem, Says You, where he rhymes rain with domain. Errol Flynn slept rough in the Domain. We know that from his autobiography, and a lot of other people did, and certainly in the 1890s a lot of homeless men were living here in a tent city in this part of the Domain where we're actually standing now. And the authorities didn't move them on. They understood the problem, and they actually would boil the billy here and go down fishing in the morning for breakfast. But I can assure you that's not romantic. The statue here is by the sculptor Lambert, and it was his last work, and it's a magnificent composite group. The young Henry is standing there with his hand held out as if imploring for a beer, and we know that young men sometimes climb this statue and put a beer can, an aluminium beer can in his hand. We can say that that's historically correct insofar as Lawson was an alcoholic, but not so insofar as they would have had bottles in those days. The statue of Henry was modelled from his son Jim, actually, the body from his son Jim. The swagman there was from a man called Conrad von Hagen, and the dog came from the local pound. There's also a fence and rail there, a post and rail you can see around the corner. And I love this statue because it reminds me of my grandfather, James Joseph Wilson, who was in fact a cocky farmer who did wear a hat like that with a ring of corks around it to keep away the flies. So there was no flies on him.
Says you. When you've tramped the Sydney pavements till you've counted all the flags, and your flapping boot soles trip you and your clothes are mostly rags, when you're called a city loafer, shunned, abused, moved on, despised, 50 hungry beggars after every job that's advertised. Don't be beaten. Hold your head up. To your wretched self be true. Set your pride to fight your hunger. Be a man in all you do. For it can't go on forever, and I'll rise again, says you. When you're dossing out in winter, in the darkness and the rain, crouching, cramped and cold and hungry neath a seat in the Domain, and a cloaked policeman stirs you with that mighty foot of his. What do you mean? What's this? Who are you? Come on, move on, get out of this. Don't get mad. It's only foolish. There is nothing you can do. Save to mark his beat and time him, find another hole or two. But it can't go on forever. I'll have money yet, says you.
We're now standing outside the old Sydney Herbarium, and the date on the portico you can see is 1899. This rather grand Italianate building was built in the time of Joseph Henry Maiden, who was the director over about 3-year period. And in it we have a collection of preserved specimens, including plants collected at Botany Bay in 1770 by Banks, and this is not where we grow herbs, for those who sometimes think that is so. Now, the reason we've stopped here is that it's quite a significant spot, because I believe that Kenneth Slessor would have stood in this very spot, because he wrote a poem that was called The Herbarium, and in it he is referring, I think, to the writing on the portico.
Elegy in a Botanic Gardens. The smell of birds' nests faintly burning is autumn. In the autumn I came where spring had used me better, to the clear red pebbles and the men of stone, and founded beetles, to the broken Meleager, and thousands of white circles drifting past, cold suns in water, even to the dead grove where we had kissed, to the Tristania tree where we had kissed so awkwardly, noted by swans with damp, accusing eyes. All gone today. Only the leaves remain, gaunt paddles ribbed with herringbones of watermelon pink. Never before had I assented to the hateful name
Marita macrophylla
on a tin tag. That was no time for botany. But now the schools, the horticulturalists come forth triumphantly with Latin. So be it now.
Marita macrophylla.
And the old house, ringed with black stone, no Georgian headlong hall, with glass-eye windows winking candles forth, stuffed with French horns, globes, air pumps, telescopes, and Cupid in a wig playing the flute. But truly, and without escape,
The National Herbarium.
repeated dryly in Roman capitals,
The National Herbarium.
We've now reached the statue's graveyard, which is up behind the succulent garden, or between the succulent garden wall and the edge of the gardens, the fence. It's a very evocative space because we're under the deep shade of fig trees with hanging roots in a banyan type formation. I first came up here in the early 80s because I was looking for the statue of Summer. I'd read a poem by Nan MacDonald and she was talking about summer, and from this I got a sense of what the statue looked like. And then we were researching some old newspaper clippings and we actually found a clipping of when this statue came to the Sydney Gardens, and it was way back in 1883. In my travels, I then came across another poem by David Campbell about lost summer, and this really got me going. So one day in 1988 I was up here in this graveyard looking around the bits and pieces, and I found Summer, but sadly she was decapitated. I knew it was Summer by the description of the poem and the sheaf of wheat that she held in her hand. And also the word summer was written across the base of the statue, but this was definitely the Summer that had been in the gardens down near the restaurant that David Campbell and Nan MacDonald had both written about. And she's now been moved into a more secure enclosure.
Wet Summer, Botanic Gardens. Under the low, dark sky and the sodden leaves, poor Summer bared her shoulder with coy grace. Her marble flesh streaked with mortality, her sheaf of wheat lay mildewed on her arm. Her eyes stared vacant from her tear-stained face, on paths empty at noon. On glooms beneath great fig trees where the drop of rotting fruit broke the warm, damp hush, on unbelievable green of wet grass still unfaded by the sun, in this strange season. Once we laughed to see that foolish white thing named for the brazen queen, whose sword we knew, the fierce and splendid one. But tonight, alone with the steady sound of rain, I do not smile, seeing her image there on the haunted edge of sleep, the blackening marble, the blind and weeping eyes, the ruined grain, seeing this season of the world's despair.
We are now at the site of the first farm that was ever created in Australia in terms of growing European crops in rows with furrows and the like. And this farm was set up in 1788 and it can be seen on maps that Philip had sent back to England. One of our very early illustrious farmers here was a man called Joseph Gerald. And Gerald was one of the so-called Scottish martyrs, and he'd been sent out of this country on the crime of sedition for 14 years of penal servitude. I was very interested in what this man had done, and I went to the State Library and I researched this man, and I'd envisioned him as an old man, but it turned out he was a young man and he was a barrister, so he was a very learned and educated man, and he had actually conducted his own defence, but it was a show trial, so he got the thumbs down. What were his crimes? Well, he was committed for the offence of advocating annual elected parliaments, and that was in a time when only men could vote anyhow. He was sentenced for attending an illegal meeting. He was sentenced for using some French terms or words, and specifically he was sentenced for using the word citizen. Now we think that's a pretty okay word today, but citizen in the 1790s was a verboten word, and it would be equivalent to me calling you a communist in America in the 1950s or a chauvinist in Australia in the 1970s. Gerald actually farmed here for a very short time. He was very homesick. He probably had a broken heart, and he suffered from tuberculosis, and he died here very soon after his arrival and was buried on his lease. And to the best of my knowledge, we are standing very close to Gerald's grave, which was about halfway between the site of the old wishing tree and the creek.
At Joseph Gerald's grave, half Irish patriot who knew the value of an entry and a pause, orator, barrister, offended with his hair and views from reading Thomas Paine, could have escaped to France on bail, lived on the run, but fronted the McCarthyists, got 14 years for some French terms, specifically for citizen. Uprooted from his native land, he left behind a wife and son. Allowed to farm, he scratched a life with felons and recidivists. Died Christ-like at the age of Christ. Joseph Gerald, one of ye seditionists, a man of sympathy and wit, was buried in his garden at his own request, from which his cause took root in meagre soil. For freedom is a hardy plant, ideas take wing, whose time has come.
Well, here we are down at Mrs. Macquarie's chair with all the Japanese tourists, and you can almost smell the salt. The chair, as you can see on the inscription, was carved out of solid sandstone in 1816, and that basically marked the completion of the roadworks around the domain and the establishment of the Botanic Gardens. The road was paid for by rum, and it was a rum road, as they say. There was a rum wall and it was a rum hospital. And when the road was finished, according to Macquarie's diary, he gave the workers in the chain gang a keg of rum to celebrate. But we didn't come here to talk about this chair or rum, but about another chair. In the year 1816, the year that this chair was carved, a young man called Charles Anderson was born in a workhouse in England. And he was sentenced to penal servitude for larceny and ended up on Goat Island, which is the island just on the other side of the bridge, to the west of the bridge where we're standing now. On Goat Island, or Mel Mel, he was a problem prisoner, and he dared to look at a passing ship, amongst a few other things, and he was flogged as a consequence of that. And they flogged him mercilessly, and he became or was slightly deranged. And they couldn't handle him, so they carved a seat out of stone. There's another seat in sort of symmetry to this one, carved out of stone, and they chained him to that seat for a couple of years. And because he wasn't intractable, at night they would bolt him into his chair. They had a cover that they'd bolt him in. And not only that, they used to feed him by pushing the food to him on a stick. And, you know, this is part of the birth of our country, and the people from Balmain, the equivalent of tourists, would, you know, come across in their boats to hear him scream. And I have written a poem about Charles Boney Anderson and his chair.
Poor man's chair. On the 13th of June 1816, the rum road round the government domain, 3 miles and several hundred yards of sweat recorded in the rock, took Lady Sic Macquarie to her favourite spot. A chair carved in the stone, on which she'd sit and watch her ships come in, the ultimate cachet of quality neglect, the barbed wire tangle of the brooding bush from Windsor to Cathay. And be it thus recorded in this poem, that in the same year of our Lord, one Charlie Boney Anderson was workhouse born, unlettered, without grace and vantage of command, apprenticed to the pits at 8. Wounded in action for his king and mentally deranged, fell into drinking and to scraps, some windows smashed, a brace of years in Sydney town to cool his heels for breaking glass and larceny. Chain gangs on Mel Mel split the rock for magazine and store. Young Boney, 18, crazed with pain, escaped and swam ashore, recaptured, flogged to emphasise the stain. And then to slake the quickened shell, some felons were unfettered. Boney felt the cat again for looking round at work and staring at a ship, an ostentatious act above his place and station. Escaped, caught, escaped, the claw exposed his spine, 1,000 cuts and more to train him as a dog. Left maggots on his back, he stank, clapped back in irons and sentence passed. 600 days and nights, and 60 more, and 10 of solitary for tyranny defied. Chained naked by the neck to crumbling stone beside the old lime pit, they fed him with a stick. The burghers and lacks of Sydney town rode past for sport, threw offal and taunts, watched him scramble and limp, as Boney, in his syncopated dreams, carved out a seat in pain. The people of Balmain could hear his screams. Chastened with shame, Burke ordered him up north to Port Macquarie's sin. Escaped, lived with the blacks, recapture, stripped his back again. He killed a trap to purge himself with blood, praying to swing. Condemned to live in Kingston with the pines and flax, a lag at 24, the mill for grinding souls had done enough. A pious and enlightened Scot then ranged him with the cows, tamed both the beast and man. And back in Sydney town, the wall of bush was raised for musty elegance and amnesties of shame. Saved by the harbour's moat from wrecker's ball and chain, a poor man's chair in naked stone, a brutal gene, the seat remains.
We've come now to the satyr statue that was done by the Australian sculptor Frank or Guy Lynch, and that was way back in 1924. It's now housed in a little enclave near the Opera House gate, and it's a beautiful little area. This statue was considered to be rather obscene in its day, and it languished in the art gallery for about 50 years. And this particular cast was only made in the early 70s when it was put out here. We're stopping here because this statue has a strong association with Australian poetry, because the model for the upper half of the statue was Joe Lynch, the brother of Frank. And Joe is the man who jumped or fell off a ferry on the way to a party at Mossman, just near here, just out in the water. And of course that was the inspiration to Slessor's Five Bells poem. Frank used to come to this spot quite often and just stand on the water's edge and look out. It's recorded that he came here because he was very close to his brother. And the two of them now, I guess, are encapsulated in some ways in this bronze.
Time that is moved by little fidget wheels is not my time, the flood that does not flow. Between the double and the single bell of a ship's hour, between a round of bells from the dark warship riding there below, I have lived many lives, and this one life of Joe, long dead, who lives between five bells.
Well, we've walked up the hill in the slight rain to see the very large and very ornate Philip statue, which to my mind is a piece of high Victorian kitsch. Now, I don't want to talk about the sculpture necessarily in detail, but to mention that there's a reference here to Australian poetry, because according to Manning Clark, the radicals and republicans of the day had opposed this statue because they, didn't want a monarchist thing in their beautiful gardens, and they had a public meeting and they passed a minute opposing this. And then the authorities called a second meeting, and it was still knocked back by the Republicans, and the third meeting then was called, which was stacked, and the vote went the other way, and Henry Lawson was disgusted, and apparently he walked across Hyde Park, also in the rain, and wrote the first draft of his poem Song of a Republic.
Sons of the South, awake, arise. Sons of the South, and do banish from under your bonny skies those old world errors and wrongs and lies, making a hell in paradise that belongs to your sons and you.
Well, we've now walked almost full circle, and we can see the domain where we started off, just over here on my left, and we have stopped at the Shakespeare statue or the Shakespeare Memorial, and that is just near the State Library of New South Wales. But I'm sure you can hear the motor cars, because what was once a nice quiet little plaza has now become a traffic island. And this is all due to the glories of the Coal Expressway and the Great God motor car and all that sort of stuff. On those steps, just across the road, B. Miles stood in her sand shoes and her sunshade, and she would recite Shakespeare at 1 shilling for a quatrain, which is just lovely. The statue has many of Shakespeare's characters here, and you can see Shakespeare up there on the top. And the reason we've stopped here is the Sydney poet Ronald McCaig lost his girlfriend here and wrote his own quatrain.
But I don't love Shakespeare's bronze statue. It was there that you left me, and I left you.